Hi, Simon. Hi, Matt. I'm Ronnie, founder and CEO of Viewers Logic. With me here are Matt Hill, Director of Research and Planning in Thinkbox, and Simon Moen, which is Head of Data in the Viewers Logic, and came from a background in the 7 Stars, where he was for 7 years a senior data analyst. And we are here today to discuss TV sponsorship and to try to better understand the effectiveness of this sponsorship and how it can be measured. So let me start with a question to both of you on why is sponsorship important? What is the role of sponsorship within a campaign? Matt, maybe you can start with this.
Yeah, happy to kick off on that. So I think sponsorship for many years has been a really cost-effective way of maintaining presence sort of throughout a year. So quite often sponsorships have been sort of long-running partnerships with program strands, channels, and allow a way for advertisers to have a continued presence that nicely complements their spot activity. I think also really it's been used as a great way in which to find a really appropriate contextual alignment. So we see a lot of supermarkets will be interested in sponsoring and being associated with cooking shows, and I think that ability to align yourself in a certain context, so that when people are in market for that particular product, they're going to be more likely to associate you, that brand, with that particular market, particular context. So I think there's a couple of ways in which brands have been using it, and I think we're seeing the use of sponsorship really evolve over probably the last 5 to 10 years, where brands have got much better and the broadcasters have got much better at producing really sort of integrated partnerships, where it's not just a sort of last minute media, low value kind of let's buy it because it's good value. Let's actually properly invest in this. Let's make a really good creative. Let's activate this sponsorship with other activity, either in store or with other spot type advertising. And so I think the potential for sponsorship in terms of its ability to deliver against sort of different marketing objectives has really sort of grown and thrived over the last 5 or so years.
Thank you. Simon, anything to add?
Not a whole lot. I mean, Matt covered the basis pretty much there. So yeah, it's a very cost-effective way of maintaining a consistent TV presence. It means that you can get very high frequency exposures to specific audiences that you choose to target. And you get to kind of communicate your brand values through the property that you're sponsoring, and therefore yeah, like Matt suggested, you can build up those associations with your brand and strengthen it that way.
So, yeah, we've seen interesting stuff on the sort of the brand rub side of things with sponsorship, because context is like an obvious one, but then you can get other things around if you're sponsoring a comedy sort of strand or comedy program, then you start to take on those qualities. You become more light-hearted in the way that you're perceived, and I think that's quite an interesting sort of side effect, is that you as a brand, you want to think about what are the properties that share my values or have values that I'd like to borrow, that I'd like to rub off on my brand. And that's a lot of the way that the brands will be using sponsorship. It's about going, oh, what am I weak at, or what would I really like to strengthen in terms of my brand qualities, and sponsorship can be a good way of doing that.
And just from an industry perspective, I think it's quite interesting because TV sponsorships, those idents, they are quite restricted in that you're not allowed to have a call to action. So the messaging is quite limited, but that means it's quite interesting to see the kind of creative ways that agencies and brands go about communicating their message without having an explicit call to action, which means it's something different, and oftentimes you end up with some quite interesting case studies.
Yeah, it's a beautiful constraint, isn't it? In some ways, it's one of those things that sort of constrains your activity, but it means you have to be more creative in how you adopt it.
This is an interesting point. And do you think that because of this restriction, would you say that sponsorship is a longer term a tool? Does it have also a short term effect? How do you see it?
Do you want me to kick off, or shall I start? Because I think this is really interesting. In general, yes, I do. I think that the restrictions around what you can do within a sponsorship, you're not allowed to put out an offer. You're not allowed to generate a really sort of clear call to action. So when we think about sort of typical performance marketing, which is all about generating a sort of a direct and a measurable response, it's harder with sponsorship because you're just not allowed to do that from a creative point of view. And so typically sponsorship is used more as a brand vehicle as opposed to an activation vehicle. But again, I think this is evolving and this is changing, and how you use other activities around the sponsorship can give you, if you're using more activation-led spot advertising within the same content, then you can start to actually trigger the sponsorship. You can activate it and drive a call to action. And I know, Simon, you've been doing a lot of work on this kind of area. You've probably got some strong views.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, there's no doubt that sponsorship is first and foremost a long-term exercise. It's you're not going to get a positive ROI from sponsorship within the first week. It's something that builds over time with those brand associations, where you go get both a direct and an indirect effect, in the sense that it influences the performance of other channels. However, like in the world we live in, there's increasing demand for seeing at least some return in the short term. And so that's where a lot of the work that we have done in the sponsorship space does kind of demonstrate that actually the returns do kick in quite early on, but they do build over time, and it's really in the long term that you're going to see the real effects. But you do need to demonstrate that you're getting returns from it both in the short and in the long term.
Thank you. Okay, so this leads us to the next topic, which, as you said, if you can't measure sponsorship, it would be very hard to sell it, because today brands are obsessive, and rightfully so, about understanding the ROI and putting the money where in the best place they can. So how is sponsorship measured today? How do you look at the long-term, short-term effect of sponsorship, Matt?
So sponsorship, well, let's start in terms of measuring TV as a whole, alongside sort of other channels that don't have that kind of return path data. Measuring effectiveness and measuring return on investment has for a long time been a more challenging type of process. Although I think we've learned that generally the return path attribution type of approach can be quite limited in terms of its ability to understand the holistic influence of media on each other. So sponsorship in this same way is makes it harder to measure in terms of understanding how it's impacting on sales and how it's impacting on actions. It's always had a slight advantage over just general spot advertising, in that you've got quite a nice easy way in which you can define people who are exposed and people who aren't exposed, because you can just simply go, right, who's watched the program, who hasn't watched the program. That gives me two pretty nice clean samples in which we can test against. And so historically it's been very much a brand tracking led approach, and generally when you buy a TV sponsorship, you also will be getting access to a company and sort of brand tracker that will look at the impact the sponsorship has had sort of post the campaign. It will compare the brand perception, the attitudes, the consideration, the awareness amongst viewers of the program versus non-viewers of the program. So I think that's generally been the traditional way in which sponsorship has been measured. Some businesses use econometrics, and you can use econometrics to assess the impact that sponsorship has. But I think what we're about to hear from Simon is that there's other ways in which we can do this, and that we're getting access to to the, interesting data sets that can give us clues and tell us how our sponsorship is performing in the short and long term. So I'll hand over to Simin to give a bit more detail on that.
Yeah, I mean it is in a sense a bit of an imperfect landscape, because obviously survey data has its own challenges, and things like econometrics, it takes a long time to turn around, and you need a lot of data for it to be robust, and you need sort of periods with and without sponsorship, and with and without other activity. Anecdotally, from my agency days, there were also brands that wanted to measure their sponsorships in a spot lift model, i.e., you upload the timestamped idents into a platform that looks at the immediate uplift in traffic right afterwards. To my eternal shame, I have to say I did agree to doing that on one occasion, which is, to be candid, an utterly pointless exercise, because I mean, can discuss the long and short term benefits of sponsorship, but you certainly won't get the returns from the sponsorship within 10 minutes of the ident airing. So there is a bit of that going on as well, but hopefully I like to think that most brands and agencies have more integrity than I did on that one occasion when I agreed to it. Just
Well, it's
just to be
madness,
clear,
really,
on all subsequent occasions, I refused.
Yeah, it's a bit because your idents are going. A, you can't put in any obvious call to action. B, your idents are right next to content that people love. They're not going to be disappearing off to go and search for your brand, and so that's just going to give you a fraction of the direct effect that you're seeing, and I think could be hugely misleading, couldn't it?
Yeah, I mean, at Views Logic, we talk a lot about how you don't get immediate returns from a TV spot within the first 10 to 15 minutes, and you certainly wouldn't with an ident, because yeah, it's an excellent point, Matt, that you're watching a program that presumably you enjoy. You're not going to visit the website of whoever owns the sponsorship idents that you just seen when the program's about to start. It's just not human behavior on any level. So yeah,
maybe
yeah, no, I was just going to say. So we did kind of see a gap, I suppose, in the sponsorship measurement space, and thought that with the nature of viewers logic data, it's something that we can really make a big contribution to in terms of uncovering the short and long term effects of TV sponsorships.
So maybe you can present the findings of your research, and maybe even talk a bit about the methodology of how was it done, so everyone will understand.
Yeah, sure thing. Views Logic, for those of the viewers and listeners who don't know, we operate with single source data. It's all based off of a panel of 8,500 people, where we essentially track everything that they do. So that includes their TV viewing. So we know what they watch on TV. Crucially, we know whether they're watching the programs that whose sponsorship that we're looking to measure, and we also know their subsequent behavior, what websites they visit, what apps they use, what businesses they visit in real life, what they buy in the supermarket. And so what that means is that we're able to really connect the dots between somebody being a viewer of a TV program and changing their behavior off the back of being exposed to a sponsorship. Whether that is, like I said, using the app of the advertiser, or visiting the website, and we're able to get a longitudinal view on that, so we can see to what extent does the behavior change in the first month, the first 2 months, 3 months, etc. There's really no hard limit on how far we can look into the future, as it were, on that. And so that means that we are able to capture both the long and short term benefits of sponsorships. And we've done a few different projects on this, looking at various sponsorships. The one that we are choosing to highlight here is KFC's sponsorship of the World Cup on ITV. And I think that's quite an interesting one in the context of what we spoke about in terms of the constraint of not having a call to action, because it was a sponsorship that I personally think was very creatively done. I don't know if everyone remembers the idents that ran, but it was essentially people running around with bags of fried chicken trying to get home in time for the game. And then the ident making the point that with KFC delivery, you can watch the entire match and you can still eat your chicken. So it was almost like a TV spot in that sense, but crucially without that call to action. But I thought that was very well solved. And so we've looked at both the short and the long term effects of this, and we've looked at it both in the direct effect terms, i.e., what did the sponsorship do in and of itself, but also the indirect effect, how did it influence responsiveness to KFC's TV spots. We start with the direct effect, so essentially a comparison of app usage for the KFC app across different time periods, and we've divided the viewers logic panel according to their viewing behavior during the World Cup, specifically how much of the ITV coverage did they watch. So looking at average minutes spent per month in the KFC app across 3 groups here. In blue, that's people who watch 15 minutes or less of ITV's World Cup coverage. Then you have between 15 minutes and 2 hours in orange. And then you have more than 2 hours in grey. And what's interesting here is that we are seeing a short-term effect quite early on. Remember, the World Cup was November and December. And you can see there is, especially in the 2 hour plus group, the grey line, there is a quite distinct uplift in November and December. There's an increase there in the grey line, which just continued. The orange line, i.e. the medium viewers, as it were, between 15 and 120 minutes. It's a bit more erratic, but the general trend is upwards. While crucially, the trend for people who watch 15 minutes or less is really downwards from December onwards. So you can see how this changes over time, where in September and October, the grey line, i.e. people who watched 2 hours or more, were actually lower than the 2 other groups. But from February all the way through to May, it was those people were the ones who spent the most time within the KFC app. And we're seeing an increase in the 15 to 120 minutes group as well. So you could really see here the incrementality, both in terms of the immediate return, but also how that builds over time. Then we've changed the metric a little bit, and now we're looking at the share of app usage. So that's been a competitive sector of KFC, McDonald's, Deliveroo, Just Eat, and Uber Eats, so food delivery apps, essentially. And what is KFC's share within those within that sector? We're looking at that both for World Cup viewers and non-World Cup viewers. And to clarify, a World Cup viewer is somebody who watched at least 1 hour cumulatively of ITV's World Cup coverage. And a non-viewer is somebody who didn't watch anything at all. And you can see here that when we look at the difference between September, October 2022 and January to June 2023, both groups increased their share for KFC usage, but it increased significantly more in the World Cup viewers group. So there's a 5 percentage point difference there. So it's 12.2% increase for people who didn't watch the World Cup, 17.2% for people who did watch the World Cup. So it's a higher increase despite starting from a higher base. And so that increase, those 5 percentage points, it equates to about a 40% difference in the increase. So there's actually quite a substantial incrementality difference there in terms of what we're seeing in the first 6 months of 2023 for people who watch the World Cup. Then we move on to the indirect effect. And anecdotally, I can say that from other projects that we've done, what we tend to see with sponsorships is that the indirect effect tends to be stronger. So the biggest returns that you get from sponsorships isn't necessarily what you get directly from the sponsorship itself, but more from how it influences other media activity, and specifically TV spots, how being exposed to sponsorship idents really makes people more prone to respond to a TV ad. And that's what we're looking at here. We're comparing response rates, either percentage of an audience that went on to respond with an app session in KFC. And again, we are looking at those different audiences, World Cup viewers and non-World Cup viewers. And we've used the same threshold. So a World Cup viewer is somebody who's watched at least an hour. And to take the sort of short-term effect first, and in the short term here, we're looking at a period of December to February. So sort of the first 2 months after the World Cup, and how did responsiveness change between those two groups? So non-World Cup viewers and World Cup viewers. So seeing there was an increase in both groups, 5.7% for people who didn't watch the World Cup, 7.5% for people who did watch the World Cup. So again, there's a measurable incrementality even in the short term within those first 2 months. What's interesting is that the effect is even stronger in the long term. So what we're looking at here is March to May. So suddenly we're looking at sort of 3 months after the World Cup on to 5 months after. And how did responsiveness to TV ads change in that period? And you'll see the increase among the World Cup viewers is smaller this time around. It's gone from 7.5% down to 5%. But when you compare that to the control group, as it were, i.e. the people who didn't watch the World Cup, that remained flat. And so the incrementality that we're attributing to the sponsorship is now up to 5 percentage points. So that's even greater than it was in the short term. So the implication here is that there is a measurable effect in the short term, but that actually grows over time. And we see that very clearly here when we break down response rates for the two groups by month. I was seeing September, October, November, December. It's relatively even. We're seeing the World Cup viewers are a little bit ahead. But from February onwards, really, that's when you start to build up a delta there. And you see that the difference is suddenly quite substantial between the two groups. And the difference remains at a very high level. So this is where you can kind of see the overall view on when do the effects of a sponsorship kick in. You see the effects early on already. You see sort of in January, tentatively, you're seeing a bit of an increase. But it's really February onwards that you're getting the real returns. And so that goes a long way, I think, to answer the question about balance between short and long-term effects of sponsorship.
Very interesting. So, in other words, in order to understand the ROI and in order to understand the effect of the sponsorship, we need to look at least several months after to understand the effect, because otherwise we just see a tiny part of this effect.
Absolutely. And I mean, and there's nothing wrong with looking for effects in the short term. There's nothing wrong with saying maybe a month in, are we seeing any effects here? I think but the important thing is just to keep in mind that it is a long-term exercise, and even if the returns you're seeing aren't equating to a positive or ROI already, there's no reason to panic, because the real returns will come further down the line. We're big fans of measurement, obviously, and so to keep measurement tracking on and making sure that you're keeping an eye on the effectiveness, that's absolutely fine. But there needs to be an understanding that this is a long-term exercise.
So, in other words, you can use it in two ways. One way is after a short term, let's say after a month or two, just to check, is it working? Maybe you need, maybe your creative isn't good, you need to change it or something like this. But this is not in order to check the ROI. If you want to understand the ROI, you need to wait a longer time and look at the whole effect of the sponsorship. Okay. What do you think, Matt, this is for you, would be the role of these types of hard measurements versus the softer measurements of the brand effect, of the brand survey, etc.?
Yeah, I think it's important that this doesn't necessarily replace the need for understanding the impact that your sponsorship is having on your brand. I think, as we talked about earlier, primarily the role of sponsorship is about how people feel about your brand, and we're quite longitudinal tracking studies in the past, which actually reflect some of this finding that the decay rate for sponsorship is very, very slow after a sponsor has ended. The brand health scores remain high for a long period of time. And again, coming back to the point that we talked about earlier, if you're thinking about what your marketing objective is, if your marketing objective is about borrowing some of the qualities of the program that you're sponsoring, you want to be able to assess, have you done that? Have you increased in some of those key perception traits, those personality traits that you're trying to put onto your brand, which you won't necessarily see from this type of study. But I think if you put the two things together, if you're presenting this kind of information to your CFO in terms of saying, right, we've sponsored this program, it cost us this much money. These were our objectives. We wanted to deliver a measurable result across this period in terms of driving traffic or driving footfall. Here's the data that shows that we've done that. And also we wanted to improve the way our brand is perceived, and here's the data that shows that. Then you've got a really strong business case. And I think certainly the CFOs who tend to be more rationally minded will probably slightly value more the direct measurable effects from the brand, but it allows you as a marketer to do both things, which is to drive actual business results and drive more long-term brand benefits that is going to support the rest of your marketing activity.
Yeah, more data is almost always better than less data. So of course, if you have multiple angles that you can use to kind of triangulate the ultimate effect, then that is obviously the ideal world. I guess we are coming from it at ViewsLogic from a slightly different angle in the sense that we kind of see the softer metrics as proxies, like things like consideration and purchase intent aren't that valuable unless they actually translate into increased usage or in customer acquisitions, which ultimately, let's face it, will happen. Like if somebody views a brand more favorably, they are more likely to become customers of that brand. But if you have the data that shows the actual conversions, the actual increase in app usage or time spent or purchase or whatever your KPI is, that will ultimately trump the softer data the way we see it, certainly, because that's the end goal, right? Like having people think favorably about your brand, but without either spending any money on it, that's not something that's necessarily all that valuable to advertisers.
I think it's going to vary, isn't it, depending upon what brand you are, what business you are, what category. And what is the overall marketing objective of this activity? So I think we know that sponsorship is particularly important to autos. I think we've seen some data recently that suggests that TV sponsorship is almost like half of the exposure they get on TV, and they use it for that burn of having a consistent level of awareness longitudinally over time, that they can really start to cement some of those brand values because they're on such long purchase cycles. So I think it's the brand effects for autos is going to be really, really important relative to the sort of direct effect of people seeing a sponsorship and going out and buying a car, which we know doesn't happen. But then on the other end of the scale, there's going to be quite a high, specific, more activation-led campaign. KFC is a great example of that, where you're in market at a great time of year. You've got a huge scale of the program that you're sponsoring, and I think coming back to some of the results you're seeing, you're talking about sort of changes in market share, which aren't huge figures, but when you think of the scale of the World Cup, the number of viewers that will be watching it, that's big business. And so they'll want to be seeing that kind of direct effect. So I think it's going to differ, isn't it, depending on what type of company you are.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a really good point. And yeah, with something like car brands and those kind of extremely high consideration purchases, or other brands where it's very difficult to kind of identify the actual hard KPIs, then obviously we'll have to lean more on the softer KPIs if it is extremely difficult to connect the dots, as it were, between the exposure and the purchase, especially if the purchasing cycle, like you say, is several years. So yeah, no doubt about it. Like, every measurement strategy should be tailored towards the brand. But yeah, in general terms, at least, we tend to value the harder metrics more than the soft ones.
Okay. Last question. I think it will be last. So, today with the recession, we just saw that TV budgets were cut. The ITV CEO said it's the toughest recession in 15 years. And as we know, because of these pressures, a lot of the brands are focusing on short-termism and really are looking more for an immediate effect. How do you think this affects the sponsorship market? And will the ability to measure the ROI be able to change it if it affected badly?
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting one, because alongside the sort of the grim outlook that came with the ITV results the other day, they also mentioned that the partnership sponsorship market was actually surprisingly buoyant, and that they're getting multiple offers for some of their big shows. And then I think at times like this, what you can see is that stuff goes to market and ends up getting picked up at quite a low cost as a sort of value offering, and we're not really seeing that at the moment. So I'm not entirely sure why that would be, because typically you do see a skew towards short-termism in tough times. I think we've certainly seen that money is shifting more to the late market, which means that channels that can activate at the last minute, search, social media, tend to benefit more than something that requires a bit more planning and commitment, like sponsorship. But perhaps sponsorship is being seen as something that can offset this, and that they're aware that they probably are playing too high on the activation side, and that sponsorships are quite a cost-effective way in which they can ensure that they keep their brand presence going. But irrespective of market conditions, we are moving to a point in time where accountability is front and center of every business's thinking. And there is no doubt that the more we can do to demonstrate the value, to understand the impact of TV activities, be it sponsorship, be it broadcast of VOD, be it spot advertising, the better we'll be able to sell ourselves as a medium. And I think it's look, we do a lot of research into understanding the effectiveness of TV. We see lots of great case studies of TV in action working, and we know that it works. One of the challenges is proving it and finding those proof points. So I think this type of analysis, this type of analytics, is just brilliant for TV, because the more we do it, and the more that advertisers start getting accustomed to using data like this, the more confidence they're going to have in their TV activity, and the more effective their campaigns are going to be. And it's going to be, it'll create a virtuous circle in terms of the role of TV on the media plan. So I think aside from the current grim market, I think this type of analysis is just going to be more and more important going forward.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the cost effectiveness of sponsorship is certainly a key factor, I think, in why that market is, for the time being fairly buoyant. Because yeah, I think a lot of brands have either reduced or cut their TV spot budget, but want that TV presence, and so sponsorship is a way of doing that. What obviously might happen is measurement challenges and the lower impact in the short term, as it were, because a brand might expect that a sponsorship would have the same sort of short-term impact as a TV spot campaign will, but it just won't. So it's the wrong thing to benchmark against, but inevitably for many, it is the only thing they can benchmark against. And so there's often a lack of measurement and a lack of short-term effect. And on those 2 points, it's very much what we're there to help with, to both demonstrate that there is an effect in the short term, but also to reassure advertisers that the real effects will come in the long term, and it's just a question of patience.
Okay, thank you very much for both of you. Is there anything you want to add that we didn't cover?
I think we covered all the ground, didn't we?
I think so as well.
Fingers crossed we did. You can always get questions in afterwards and we can do our best.
Okay, perfect. Thank you very much.